Hello, welcome to lecture 36. So far we have covered the policy and the planning element of the housing at the city level and at the local level. We discussed most of the housing typologies one by one, how we can take the strategy at the city level. Starting from the formal housing strategy to informal to various types of housing typology. In today's lecture we will discuss another very important element which is very important to take care and integrate within the housing strategy at every level. It can be taken at the city level, regional level, or even at the project level. We have to take care, and that is much more important and related to human lives and its security and safety. So, disaster resistant housing, that is the topic for today's lecture. Now, I hope that you have heard this term disasters, and disaster. Probably in some of the recent events like earthquake, flood, or any landslide or any events, you might have seen that because of the disasters there are human casualty, loss of property, and a huge loss of resources nationally and regionally. So, because of that, the why so much casualties are there, like let us take an example of the major disaster like say recently the Nepal earthquake. The earthquake in the Latur or Bhuj or any area where the earthquake comes, the cyclones which comes at the coastal region of India, the landslide or the flood happened in Uttarakhand in 2013. So, all these disasters, and also take the disaster like say the gas disaster in Bhopal, the city of Bhopal, or the plague outbreak in the city of Surat in 90s. So, any of the disaster, even if it is a kind of a man-made or the natural disaster, you will find that the first thing why people get so casualty because of their structure where they live. Other than the disaster situation, wherever they are living, the structure is safe and secured, but during the disaster situation the building becomes vulnerable to them. So, this is one of the reasons. That is why we need to discuss the methods and how we can take the strategy to strengthen the security and the safety of the planning, the context, and the building, both for the housing projects. So, before that, let us discuss what are the types of disaster. So, basically there are two types of disaster we follow. One is natural and second is man-made. So, out of natural disaster we consider earthquake, flood, cyclones, then drought, landslide, and within the man-made disaster there are chemical disaster, industrial disaster, and kind of similar any other disaster which is created by man. One of the thought behind this kind of differentiation of natural and man-made disaster is, if you find that for the man-made disasters, the disaster it is caused due to some events. For example, earthquake could be is created due to the event of the superimposition of the tectonic plates. You know the tectonic plates in a earth surface, there are various tectonic plates. So, because of the movement of the tectonic plates and their conflicts and their collisions, the earthquake takes place. But why people dies out of the earthquake? People does not die due to the earthquake. They die because of the structure below where they are living collapse. So, it is the house which makes them vulnerable to the disaster event. Similarly, the flood can be caused by heavy rainfall. Now heavy rainfall can cause the flood. For example, you can take the example of the 2013 flood in Uttarakhand. So due to the huge rainfall for 2 to 3 days continuously, the huge amount of water, it came to the river banks and flooded the whole settlements. Now one thought is that for earthquake, flood, cyclones, drought and landslide, we have seen that because of the urbanization, because of the higher urbanization, there are tendency to encroach or to make the settlements in the vulnerable areas. So if you make the urbanization in the vulnerable areas like mostly river banks, low lying areas, fragile hill areas, etc. So if you make urbanized settlements in all those vulnerable areas, you are more prone to get the casualty and the loss due to disaster event. That is why some people, some scholars, they say that all the natural disasters are not natural. There are also elements which is made by the people or the men like making the urbanization in the vulnerable areas. So for all kinds of disaster, it is not there is a mix, I mean there is a combination of the man-made and the natural elements. So as a result of that, we become more vulnerable. Now let us discuss briefly the meaning of the vulnerable term. So because of the disaster, like I tell you that after a earthquake event, there are many houses in a particular place, but maybe out of all those houses, 1 or 2 houses could be very strong, and it is designed considering the seismic safety codes and bylaws. So as a result of that, those houses become strong, and those are not creating any loss to the people who are living inside those houses. On the other hand, the people living in the other houses which is not that much strong, they become more prone to that disaster event. So they becomes more vulnerable. So meaning of the vulnerable is that the possibility of proneness to loss. So vulnerability, so it is defined as vulnerability. So vulnerability depends on 2 factors. One may be your internal factor, one may be external. For example, you are physically weak. So if attacked by a pathogen, virus, bacteria comes, so you may be very much susceptible for the virus attack or bacteria attack. But if your immunity system is stronger enough, you can withstand that attack by the pathogens. So that becomes your internal factors. So vulnerability depends on by and large 2 factors, which is internal and other is external. So one building maybe that can withstand the earthquake event of say Richter scale 4 or 5, but if there is a earthquake of seismic range say 8 to 9 in Richter scale, that building may collapse and may get susceptible to that event. So the external, the kind of the external, the amount or the volume of the danger due to the external events increases the vulnerability. So one part is internal, which is inbuilt within you or the people. It depends on the age, okay, and the particular community and the cultural profile, how much they are susceptible to in the disaster, and the external event depends on the severity severity of disaster event. Like so, with this vulnerability we discuss another term, that is hazard. So hazard is the event or the cause for disaster. Okay, a flood situation or a heavy rainfall can be a hazard or a cause for the disaster. So hazard leads to the vulnerability, and this leads to loss of life and property, right. So what we can do for this type of, so in this situation, now disaster, now let us accept that the disaster events are inevitable. We cannot stop the earthquake. It is such an event that it is inevitable to come in any point of time in some of the areas. But what we can do, that we can definitely restrict the urbanization in the vulnerable areas, or we can promote the urbanization in those areas which is less vulnerable. That is why in the overall planning context, what we discussed earlier during our housing strategy, we talked about the land suitability analysis. So when you discuss the land suitability, we not only discuss about the land cover and land use, its topography, its water availability or the connectivity. We also see the suitability of the land for the human habitation. If it is very situated in the low lying areas, we should not earmark that land for the future urbanization or future housing areas. If it is within the river banks, within the areas of the natural river bank areas, we should not promote the urbanization there. If it is there in the fragile hill areas, similarly we can identify several hazardous lands which we should exclude from the future urbanizable area. So this land suitability could be done for as the regional level and also city level. So at the regional level or the district level, we earmark the pockets of the areas which is urbanizable and also non-urbanizable, right. So following that kind of zoning mechanism, we end up in the areas where the possible housing and the future development can come up. Now this type of zoning in the city plan or the regional plan will not be sufficient to address the disaster situation, because I tell you that we already discussed that disaster is inevitable and we have to accept the disaster events and we have to address. So for any disaster we have to, our strategy is to accept and then address. Now how do we address the disaster event? There are 3 stages of addressing a disaster event. So one is pre-disaster, another is during, another is post-disaster. Basically in the pre-disaster level, by and large what we do is basically we take the planning intervention. And prepare for during or for other stages. Okay. So in a word we can say that it is the basically preparedness for for facing the disaster, how we are prepared, whether we are prepared with the adequate planning interventions as we discussed with the urbanizable zone and the non-urbanizable zone, those kind of actions we have taken or not. Apart from the zoning, so in the planning mechanism we have discussed that we can make the zoning at different level, regional and city level. So, this can be one action. The second action could be we have to also bring development control in such a way so that the development control will ensure the seismic safety and all kind of safety measures against the natural disaster and man-made disaster. So, in the development control we have to bring the adequate codes and standards for designing the building, constructing every type of building including housing. So, the codes and standards are available in India for the seismic safety, the flood safety, landslide and all kind of disaster situation. So, in the lecture notes these all the list of such standards and codes will be available. Please go through all the standards and try to see that what are the provisions under those standards, but definitely at the development control level you can ensure by taking undertaking and the adequate undertaking declaration drawings particulars from the building plan proposal, so that you can ensure that the building is designed and constructed following the hazard safety codes and the standards. So, at the planning level you are making zoning, at the building level you are ensuring the development control, and also you are enforcing it by using your mechanism. The second part is your action which is required during the disaster. Take an example of any disaster like cyclone or flood or any earthquake or any disaster. That time you basically you have to act in a very prompt manner to provide the relief and operation. In some of the cases you might have to work as evacuation could be another, but evacuation is possible if your preparedness in terms of other stages are robust enough. For an example, in Odisha cyclone which came in 1999, it took a lot of lives. But the next Odisha cyclone which came few years back, which the name of that cyclone was Phylan, that time very less casualty was there, because the administration, they were much more prepared than the earlier time. They are much more prepared, and because of their preparation and their preparation for the evacuation, relief and operation, most of the people were saved and it was possible. So, evacuation depends on your level of preparedness in terms of your manpower, technical manpower, trained manpower, the equipments through which you will give the relief and you will operate, the connectivity like say transportation possibility, the communication system during the disaster events. You will lose your communication in terms of your telecommunication, electricity system will be disrupted. So, every aspect you have to be prepared to take the action, and after the this stage your action will be, after the disaster your action will be basically reconstruction. So, in the reconstruction phase you have to reconstruct the building which are affected and infrastructure like roads and so building and infrastructure. So, up to some extent with the affected building also you can retrofit, that means you can retrofit some of the strengthening measure following the codes and standards that is possible in the building. So, reconstruction may be possible with using building retrofitting. So, retrofitting is the science or the method by inducing the strengthening measures after the building is constructed. It can be given after the disaster, or it can be done even at the pre-disaster situation also in this stage, enforcing stage. And also you have to reconstruct the basic infrastructure so that the people can come to the normal flow of their life. Another thing you should remember in this situation, that all these stages consider two major elements of action. So, one is structural measure, another is non-structural. Structural measures are the measures or actions and interventions which is related to the physical element of the building and the infrastructure. So, whatever we discussed, like the zoning control mechanism, building construction, the enforcement and the development control, all these are structural measurement. Okay, retrofitting, reconstruction of the building and the infrastructure. But think about the situation after the disaster, immediately within few moments or few minutes people become houseless. So, they get a mental shock, mental trauma. So, what we can do for that kind of trauma? So, they need some kind of counseling or mental rehabilitation, or sometimes we have to do some kind of awareness camp even before the disaster, so that people become much more aware about the preparedness and the during and post disaster events and their role during the disaster. So, those kind of activities which does not related to building and the infrastructure directly, but which improves the understanding about the disaster and which increases the role and the responsibility of the people pre, during and post disaster situation. Those kind of measures are called as non-structural measures. So, basically the outcome of the structural measures are physical, which can be tangible. You can see that some building has been retrofitted, some new infrastructure has been done, some new bund has been constructed, some new connectivity has been done, some building has been constructed as a cyclone shelter or emergency shelter. So, those are physical measure or the final outcome, but the outcome of the non-structural measure may not be physical. Sometimes it is social, sometimes it is mental, it could be spiritual or psychological, right. It could be cultural. For making a awareness campaign against the natural disaster, the kind of language you have to use for different language zone, different geographic zone will be naturally different. So, those are the variations of the social and cultural aspect, and those are part of non-structural measure. So, its impact may not be measurable by physical scale, it will be measurable in terms of their understanding and the preparedness of the people. Now, these are overall theoretical framework. Now, let us see what are the legal framework associated with that. Now, with the disaster and its related effect. Now, for the disaster in 2005, Government of India, they have come up with Disaster Management Act. Under this act, every state government, they have to frame a disaster management authority. Not only that, the authority is not sufficient, the authority at the state level, this will lead to the disaster management cells at the districts, cities and rural areas. Right. So, this kind of hierarchical framework, like disaster management authority is also framed at the central level. So, central disaster management authority, state level disaster management authority and district level, city level, rural areas disaster management cells will work in integration to alleviate or to mitigate or to minimize the effect of the disaster and specifically related to housing, settlements and the infrastructure which is related. So, this legal framework is there as a fact that some of the state government they have already framed their disaster management authority, some of the district authorities also have the disaster management cells, but at the city level we need lot of proactive trained manpower disaster management cell which will not only act against the natural disaster, but a city is prone to several other stresses like a city is also prone to several other risks like say waterlogging, sudden rainfall of 2 hours and 3 hours and waterlogging is there, then there could be outbreak of the disease. So, for all those of risk and the events you need a kind of a action group or action risk action group or people at the city level whose work will be to take action during the any risk area, during any disaster area and to integrate some of the intervention during the planning stage. Now, here the planning comes that as per this disaster management act and the rules and regulation framed under that, after that they have told that at every city has to frame their the city plan integrating the disaster management aspect. So, this group can be very much trained how to, and they can give their input during the plan preparation stage, during the preparation of the housing strategy altogether. So, based on the legal mandate and considering the theoretical framework what we have discussed, we can integrate these all this thing in the city development plan and also housing strategy. In fact, it should be integrated, not only housing strategy, it should be integrated in all the respective sectoral plan like mobility sector plan, sanitation sectoral plan, then waste management sectoral plan, because the disaster management is linked and integrated, linked and related to each and every sectoral plan. So, today we discuss the factors, the element of the disaster management and how it is related to housing. We told that for any disaster event it is related to housing because of the condition of the house it faces so many casualty and property loss, and we have told that there are man-made and natural disasters, and the proneness to get the loss or to get the casualty is called vulnerability. Vulnerability depends on the internal factors as well as external factors. The disaster events cause hazards and the effect of that is become the loss, and we can accept we have to accept the disaster, and so that we have to we can address the disaster in 3 phases basically: pre-disaster phase, during disaster phase and post-disaster phase. In pre-disaster phase we make the planning, we make the development control, enforcement and preparation for the next stages. During the disaster we make the evacuation, relief and operation. In the post-disaster we make the reconstruction, retrofitting and the infrastructure redevelopment. And also we also discussed that there are 2 theoretical or 2 elements, structural and non-structural. Structural elements considers physical element, non-structural elements considers the social, cultural, mental and spiritual element, and also discussed that there are legal mandates like say 2005 Disaster Management Act has come. It mandates to frame the disaster management authority at central, state and city level. At the city level, we need some trained manpower to take the action during any risk time or any disaster events, and those part of the proneness or vulnerability which may be different from city to city, place to place, those has to be integrated in the city plan, like city development plan and housing strategy, so that whenever we take action, we take the housing, we develop a city, we consider all those points and accordingly we can develop. So, with this we conclude to the today's discussion. In the next discussion, we discuss another very important part, though it not in very details. We will discuss that how housing projects are formulated, and during this formulation of the projects, how the element of real estate is involved in terms of like financing, in terms of the multi stakeholders active participation in the housing development. Those part we will discuss in the next lecture. So, thank you for your participation.